like to acknowledge my presence in unceded Coast Salish territory for a number of reasons, primarily because I'm speaking about law this evening, and the hypocrisy of not following my own law while speaking of it would be incomprehensible. And it's something I'll speak to in a moment as we go through the presentation. I'd like to acknowledge my mom and my dad. They were on the front lines of oil and gas long before I was. That might be in part where I came from. And so I come by this honestly. I'd like to honor them for supporting me and for bringing me into this world and straightening me out when I got a bit too ridiculous. The hair didn't work, but everything else was cool. Okay, so let's see if this works. There we go. Okay. So I want to start with this. This is Sack Edge Henderson. Some of you guys in this room know who he is, probably know him personally. I thought this was a really apt quote, something that stuck with me as I've studied law. I'm going to begin with a mihi mihi. And the reason I'm going to do this, it's a traditional Maori introduction. And I'm going to read it in English. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'll be referring, if we have time, to some Maori law, some stuff I picked up when I was in Aotearoa. And I felt it, again, appropriate and consistent with my own law to show that respect and to convey my respect for them publicly. Because I don't ever want to take without giving back. That's the colonizer's way, and I never ever want to have that in myself, especially now as we talk about these things and this potential. So I'll have to project. What it says is, Turtle Island is that which carries me. My mountains are Clinseza, the Beatty Peaks, the Twin Sisters. My people, or my rivers, are the Peace, the Musco, and Liard, and my nations, the Etcherdene and the Daneza. Charlene Wilderman and Roland Wilson are my rangatira, my chiefs. And the land is my marae, it's my home. And as you'll see, the last thing on that is my name, Caleb Behn. And I think that speaks to the importance that I have relative to the issues that I speak about. You know, I'm just a person. Thank you all for coming, but what I'm speaking about has very little to do with me. I've been lucky enough to pick up bits and pieces and be trained by some very brilliant people, but it's the first bits that are important. But the last bit is my name, Caleb Behn. So here's the outline. In an hour and a half, I'm going to try and get through 61 slides and a whole bunch of really ridiculous abstract concepts. A lot of you, I think, have seen me speak before. I'm going to be using a lot of the same slides, primarily because I'm sick for the last week and I just couldn't figure out a way to articulate the issues and conflicts that I see in northeastern British Columbia without using the slides I've used before. To speak about solutions and my vision of the solutions, I have to show you what the issues are. For those of you who are familiar with the Northeast, and there's a couple in the crowd, this would be obvious to you, but again, I'll do my best to be quick and just power through that. And then, of course, more importantly, I'll talk about legal pluralism, reconciliation, and Indigenous laws, and how they kind of fit together and work together, and what their potential might be. And I'll end with some concluding thoughts, and I'll actually going to challenge you guys as a consequence of this at the end, but we'll wait to the end for that. One of the many things I do whenever I speak is acknowledge my biases and acknowledge where I'm from and my background. Because I try and live traditionally to the extent that I can, I have to admit that I have a bias. The things I speak about tonight are not only based upon my experiences in Treaty 8 in British Columbia in particular. I'm tempted to talk about SAGD development, I'm tempted to talk about the tar sands, I'm tempted to talk about litigation in Alberta, but that's not my territory. My territory is British Columbia. So for those of you hoping to hear a lot about SAGD and tar sands and stuff like that, I don't really feel it's appropriate for me to posit the kinds of laws that might be applicable in that environment, despite the fact that some of those people are my kin, and I've worked with some of them. I think the principles I'm talking about, some of the applications and some of the theories I develop and kind of put forward to you might be useful, but I can only speak for myself. And as myself, this is my reality. The picture up there is me with my first caribou shot in Kaska territory pursuant to Kaska law. I had to give away everything of that first one, or else my medicine for hunting would be bad. The last piece actually I gave to John Borrows, my first day of Indigenous Law in second year, a long time ago. That's my grandma doing a hide, and that's a very poor dry meat rack. But the point with this is just that my background, my biases come from this lifestyle close to the land. Treaty 8, these are the two nations my mother and father are from respectively. Fort Nelson and West Moberly. Treaty 8 signed 1899. We adhered in 1910. The point with this, notice this map. Treaty 8 does not entirely contain the Western Canadian Sedimentary, quite clearly. But an appreciable chunk, especially the tar sands and the frack fields, northeast BC, definitely contained. It's Treaty 8 country. And that's why I approached this issue the way I did. But again, I have to admit that my territory is this. And this is big, this is huge, but it's not the whole of it. Here's some figures in the size of the Western Canadian Sedimentary. I think over $500 billion. And this is 2011 estimates based upon an article put out a week ago by the Globe and Mail, primarily. The value of this environment, this space, is ridiculous. Over $500 billion recoverable at today's market value. And that's just in bitumen. I mean, you add up the gas and the rest, this is a significant resource. And what comes with this resource is conflict. Part of the conflicts, and we mentioned sort of blockades and things like that, is based upon these. This is a map of the pipeline infrastructure of North America. My territory is right here from my dad. My mom's from down around here. This is the energy grid for petroleum and hydrocarbons in North America at this point. There's a lot proposed in this area, as many of you know. And there's issues with that. So, for example, my friend from school, Togastai, him and his people, the Wet'suwet'en Unistoten clan, are standing against the PTP line and all gas, all frack gas, all of it. And so the issues and conflicts that come from my territory are propagating and spreading out. And I'll talk about why that is and some of the implications derived therefrom. I'll do my best to run through all of this as quickly as I can. I just want people to understand what I'm talking about. This is a simple slide just describing the difference between conventional and unconventional gas. Simple point. Horizontal drilling, hydraulic fracturing. That's the only difference. There's issues with both, quite simply. But one of the unique things about this is that when you do unconventional gas, like in my territory, you see things like this. This is Chesapeake Stat Oil. So what you see on the surface is nice because it's not as much, ridiculous well pads everywhere. But subsurface, each of these little kind of puffy looking things is a fracturing event. Now this is actually inaccurate. What would be done is like between 8 and 20, 22 wells thrown onto a pad, shot down, a radial pattern going out. And then you frack it all. And you see how they line up and they move together. So the subsurface impact is significant. And my point with this is not to lambast anybody or say it's so negative or so bad, but more to suggest that the implications and the consequences of this development are poorly understood, especially when you consider what's on the surface versus what's below. Another point on conflict. There's a lot of talk about gas plays and gas resources. There's a lot of concern about aquifers, particularly in New York and in our territory as well, because that's where the drinking water comes from. That's where the surface water comes from. But the issues that I see generally come from this and this attitude. And this is the first example I wanted to put forward as an issue with resource conflict. There are spaces of dialogue, like royalties and benefits and new technology, or ways to protect this, or issues associated with it. But there's a lot that isn't. And I thought that was interesting. It's a funny dynamic with unconventional energy that there's both literal and figurative aspects to it that match up, like breaking and fracturation, which is why we've called the film I'm involved in Fractured Land. It's not just the land that gets fractured. There's like a picture of me on Facebook where I'm split in half, and that was advisedly done. Anywho, another point on resource-based conflict, at least in our territory, this is Section 4 of the Oil and Gas Activities Act as of today. And I highlighted a few interesting phrases in that. My issue with the Oil and Gas Commission, for a number of reasons, is just an issue about credibility and an issue with how a single window regulatory agency can do so many difficult things all at once. I'm not saying there's bad people there, I'm not saying they're evil, but I am saying that it's very difficult from my perspective after the things I've seen to really fully trust that an entity that has both the mandate of the provincial government and the mandate to protect the environment and the mandate to expand oil and gas production and the mandate to comply and enforce and the mandate to provide a good return for British Columbians, how does that balance out? And again, this is an aspect of resource conflict that I don't think is well understood, but I think is significant. Another point, and this is sort of scientific uncertainty, and again, I'm going to try and run through this as quick as I can. This is a map created by Gilles Wending, a hydrologist who works for Fort Nelson First Nation. So what I'm going to show you is actually this on a 3D scale. There we go. So these are just, this is a field, typically, about now. Active, completed, cased wells, suspended, abandoned wells. So this is what our territory looks like now. Between 28 and 31,000 wells in northeast British Columbia, depending on the OGC, the NEB, they have varying figures. A lot of wells. So our territory in northeast BC, much like Alberta, has a lot of existing infrastructure, both surface and subsurface. The issue is what's going to happen as unconventional energy develops. So this is sort of our modeling of what it might look like. And these lines, they're actually meant to be sort of at the bottom going out like that Chesapeake oil slide. It doesn't show up well on the slide. But the idea is that over time, say 10 or 15 years, 20 years, as the field is developed, you're going to have more and more drills and more horizontal shots and more fracking in your target seam. And that is what it is. But the question about don't worry, it's all going to be okay becomes a real problem when you look very closely. So I'm going to take a little snapshot of this section right here. So this is the shallow aquifers I mentioned earlier. This is your target zone. This is what's in between. I mean, we've had wells up there since the 60s, and I guarantee you the drilling technology was not the same as it is now. So the question is, how does this all interrelate? What happens when there's localized seismicity? What happens when you have thousands of pounds of pressure and abrasive proppants going downhole? What happens if there's a failure? What happens when there's unanticipated things in the aquifers? There's different kinds of breakages. Who knows? And so we've been arguing with the provincial government about possibilities. For example, medium and long-term water contamination. So the claim is, of course, that these are, this is a deep aquifer, probably not drinkable. This is a confining layer. So the theory is that there's sort of absolutely non-permeable layers in the rock that ensure there will never, ever be any migration of contaminants uphole. But because you are going subsurface with 20,000 pounds per square inch, and because there's local seismic events up to, I think, the average 2, 3 on the Richter scale, so relatively small, it'd be tough to feel them. But what do those do to the wells that were drilled back in the day? What do they do to other wells? What happens when you haven't mapped the aquifers underground? What is the process? And again, because unlike the regulatory agency, my people are compelled to think in long time scales, we consider what might happen in 100 years, because we'd like to be here still, or 200, or 300, or 400. And an aquifer recharge rate, that's a big number, it could be in the eons. And so the question becomes, when we think about resource conflict, what do we do about unanticipated or low probability events that carry high risk for the people that live on the land? Is that an externality, to use economics phrasing, for the oil and gas developers? Is that an environmental externality that doesn't matter when we consider royalty regimes? And that's the nature of these discussions. I mean, to our mind, this is a very significant issue. But I'm not an oil field engineer. I'm not a hydrologist. I'm barely a lawyer. So I'm not even close to a lawyer yet. I still have to do articles. But this kind of stuff, we posited 2 hypotheses. One, you have a frac and it goes back up an existing well bore that's not cased properly, or it creeps up the outside through the capillary effect. It's just a possibility. Another possibility is it does something like that, but then creeps sideways laterally across an unmapped fissure in a supposedly non-permeable layer. I don't want to get into this technical stuff too much. The point is that when we think about resource conflict, we don't just think about fights over how much there is or what's happening on the surface or how much you're impacting us. We're actually arguing about unknowns, and very significant unknowns. This is truly new technology. We're truly in a brave new world. But the brave new world isn't entirely equitable. It never has been, especially for people on the edges, especially for the Indigenous, especially for the marginalized. And so I wanted to point that out using an example as medium and long-term water contamination. It'll be appropriate for the stuff I want to talk about later. Now, another issue, cumulative impacts. I'll run through this really quick. My dad's from up here. I was up there on Monday, and I'll talk about some hard stuff that happened there on Monday. My mom's from right here. My grandma is from right there. This is Williston Reservoir, WAC Bennett Dam, which provides a lot of power, and these lights is right there. So this is our territory. Come on, there we go. These are petroleum development roads. Oh, there we go, come on. There we go. These are facilities, so glycol dehydrators, compressor stations, all kinds of stuff. Oh, there we go. Well sites as of 2005, seismic lines and the combination. Now this isn't to scale. I will show you some maps to scale. But when you look at my territory and the place that my people come from, especially up in the far end, but my mom's territory as well, the notion that just this isn't even considered together. When a seismic line, well, let's say, put it differently, when a lease that will inevitably have seismic, and if something is found, will inevitably have exploration drilling, and if something is productive, like in Liard Basin, the world's most productive exploration well ever drilled was drilled there last year. And that's up in this section here. So this is the next big play. They're moving over into the Liard, up into the Yukon side, so it's like that. How can you assess that and say to me, well, we're just selling the rights. We don't owe you an obligation to consult because there's no real impact coming from this. There's no right to put a shovel in the soil. You're not going to be impacted by that. We'll consult when it comes time to have seismic. And then when the seismic comes, they say, well, it's just seismic. There's an impact, of course, but it's not like this is a facility. And then when the facility comes, they say, well, it's a facility and we're tying in some wells, but this area is already impacted. There's been forestry, there's been seismic. Your relative interest is somewhat low, and then so it goes. And this is the dialogue, and this is discussion. And so I hope you can appreciate the nature of these conflicts, because it's very difficult from my perspective to engage and reflect and understand these processes and study the justice system. I was joking earlier that the facade of legitimacy wears thin after a while. Another way to look at cumulative impacts is just the exponential rate of drilling throughout history. And we're not even at the boom right yet. 18,000 wells in BC, that's laughable. We're way above that at this point. But again, notice how it moves. Notice how it starts. That's a conflict in and of itself, because my grandparents were concerned about this. My mom and dad were concerned about this. And now I'm concerned about that. And then that colors our interaction and our experience. When we talk about solutions to these issues, I think we have to talk about the long history that led to these situations, not just the current and contemporary situation. We were talking generations of conflict.